A single view does not an application make. Welcome back to Angular 2 Getting Started from Pluralsight. My name is Deborah Kurata, and in these next two modules, we define routes to navigate between multiple views in our application. Users like to have all of the information they need at their fingertips, so our applications often provide multiple sets of data in multiple layouts across multiple views. Routing provides a way for the user to navigate between those many views of the application, whether there are 5, 10, or hundreds. In this module, we start with an overview of how routing works in Angular. We examine how to configure routes and tie routes to actions, and we define where to place the routed components view. Currently, our app component embeds our product list component as a nested component. We instead want to define a set of routes, so the user can navigate to the welcome view, product list view, or product detail view. We've already built the product list component, and I've provided the welcome component with the starter files in the GitHub repository for this course. As part of the demos in this module, we'll build the shell for the product detail component. When we're finished with this module, we'll have a simple application that routes to multiple views. An Angular application is a single-page application. That means all of our views are displayed within one page, normally defined in the index.html file. So each of the 5, 10, or hundreds of views take turns appearing on that one page. How do we manage which view to display when? That's the purpose of routing. We configure a route for each component that wants to display its view on the page. As part of our application design, we provide a menu, a toolbar, buttons, images, or data links that allow the user to select the view to display. We tie a route to each option or action. When the user selects the option or performs the action, the associated route is activated. Activating a component's route displays that component's view. So, for example, the user selects a menu option to display the product list. The product list route is activated, and it displays its view. Let's look at that process again with an illustration. Here is the menu that we'll add to our sample application. We tie a route to each menu option using a built-in router directive called router link. When the user clicks on the product list option, for example, the Angular router navigates to the product's route. The browser's location URL changes to match this path segment, and we see /products appear in the address bar. By default, Angular uses HTML5 style URLs, which don't require the hash symbol to indicate local navigation. By using the HTML5 style URLs, you need to configure your web server to perform URL rewriting. How this is done depends on your web server. See the documentation for your web server on how to configure URL rewriting. Angular also supports hash-style routing, which does not require URL rewriting. We'll look at how to use hash-style routing later in this module. When the browser's URL changes, the Angular router looks for a route definition matching the path segment, products in this example. The route definition includes the component to load when this route is activated, in this case, the product list component. The Angular router then loads the component's template. Where does it display this template? Where we specified with the built-in routing directive called router outlet. And the product list appears. So that's how routing works. We'll examine these steps in further detail and try them out in demos as we journey through this course module. But first, let's add in these two missing components. I provided the welcome component as part of the starter files, so we only need to build the product detail component. The product detail component should ultimately look like this, but we want to focus on routing, not building another component. So let's just create a shell for the product detail component so we can route to it. In the products folder, create a new file called product-detail.component.ts and a new template called product-detail.component.html. In the HTML file, put some placeholder text and use interpolation to bind a page title, so we'll have something to display on the page. We'll see this in action a little later. Now how about the component? Recall how to build the basics of a component? Consider pausing the video now and creating a first cut of the product detail component with a page title and product properties. Continue the video when you want to see my solution. Here's what I came up with for the first cut of the product detail component. We import the component decorator. We import the iProduct interface so we can use it as the data type of our product property. We export the product detail component class. We define properties for the page title and product. And we decorate the class with the component decorator, defining our view using template URL. Is this close to what you came up with? Notice that I don't have a selector property here. The selector property is only required if the component will be nested within another component, and we don't need to nest this component. We'll instead display the component's view as part of routing. There is one more step here we need to take. Any idea what it might be? Every time we add a component to the application, we need to declare that component in an Angular module. We currently only have one Angular module, App Module, so we'll add the product detail and welcome component to the declarations array for the App Module. Let's do that now. Here we are looking at the App Module. We first import the welcome component and the product detail component. Then we add them both to the declarations array. With that, we are ready to add routing to our application. Routing is component-based, so we identify the set of components that we want to provide as routing targets and define a route for each one. Let's see how this is done. An Angular application has one router that is managed by Angular's router service. And we know that before we can use a service, we need to register the service provider in an Angular module. Similar to the HTTP module, Angular provides a router module in the Angular router package that registers the router service provider. To include the features of this external module in our application, we need to add it to the imports array of our application's Angular module. In addition to registering the service provider, the router module also declares the router directives. In the last clip, we mentioned two router directives, router link and router outlet. By importing the router module, our component templates can use these or any other router directives. Router module also exposes the routes we configure. Before we can navigate to a route, we need to ensure that the routes are available to the application. We do this by passing the routes to router module, like this. We call the router module's forRoute method and pass our array of routes to that method. This establishes the routes for the root of our application. If we want to use hash-style routes instead of HTML5 style routes, we change this code to set use hash as shown here. With that, we are ready to configure some routes. The router must be configured with a list of route definitions. Each definition specifies a route object. Each route requires a path. The path property defines the URL path segment for the route. When this route is activated, this URL path segment is appended to the URL of our application. The user can type in or bookmark the resulting URL to return directly to the associated component's view. In most cases, we also specify a component, which is the component associated with the route. It is this component's template that is displayed when the route is activated. These are all examples of route definitions. The first route simply maps a specific URL path segment to a specific component. So this URL displays the template from the product list component. The :ID in the second route represents a route parameter. The product detail page displays the detail for one product, so it needs to know which product to display. The product detail component reads the ID from this path segment and displays the defined product. We can define any number of parameters here, separated with slashes. What does this route do? Yep, this URL displays the template from the welcome component. This one defines a default route. The redirect here translates the empty route to the desired default path segment, in this example, the welcome route. A redirect route requires a path match property to tell the router how to match the URL path segment to the path of a route. We only want this default route when the entire client-side portion of the path is empty, so we set the path match to full. The asterisks in the last route denote a wildcard path. The router matches this route if the requested URL doesn't match any prior paths defined in the configuration. This is useful for displaying a 404 not found page or redirecting to another route. A few things to note here. There are no leading slashes in our path segments, and the order of the routes in this array matters. The router uses a first match wins strategy when matching the routes. This means that more specific routes should always be before less specific routes, such as the wildcard route. Ready to try this out? We are back in the sample application with the index.html file open. We want to add a base element just after the head tag. This element tells the router how to compose the navigation URLs. Since the app folder is the application root, we'll set the href for the base tag to /. Now we are ready to configure the route definitions. For that, we go to our Angular module, add the appropriate import statement, then add router module to the imports array. This registers the router service provider, declares the router directives, and exposes the configured routes. How does the router module know about our configured routes? We pass them into the router module by calling the forRoute method. We then configure the routes here by passing them in using an array. Let's start with the product routes. For each route, we specify the path and a reference to the component. The template defined in the specified component will display when the router navigates to this path. Next, we add the route to display our welcome page. We'll set the path to welcome and specify the welcome component. When the application loads, we want to default to the template from the welcome component. So we'll specify a default route that redirects to our welcome component. And let's define a wildcard path in case the requested URL doesn't match any prior paths defined in the configuration. This is often used for displaying a 404 not found page, but in our simple example, we'll use it to redirect back to the welcome page. There's a lot of stuff here now in our root application module. In a later course module, we'll look at how to refactor this module into multiple Angular modules for a separation of concerns. With routing, the user can navigate through the application in several ways. The user can click a menu option, link, image, or button that activates or navigates to a route. The user can type the associated URL segment in the address bar after the application URL, or use a bookmark to that URL. Or the user can click the browser's forward or back buttons. The route configuration handles the URLs, so the last techniques will just work. We need to handle the first technique by tying routes to the user actions. We need to decide how we will show the routing options to the user. We could display a navigation pane with links, we can provide a toolbar or images, or we can build a navigation menu like this one. In a more full-featured application, the menu could have many more options and sub-options, but this will do for our purposes. We define that menu as part of this component's template. We then need to tie a route to each menu option. We do that using the router link directive. The router link is an attribute directive, so we add it to an element, such as the anchor tag here, and we enclose it in square brackets. We bind it to a template expression that returns a link parameters array. The first element of this array is the string path of a route. Additional elements can be added to this array to specify optional route parameters. The router uses this array to locate the associated route and build up the appropriate URL based on any provided parameters. When the user selects the option, the associated route is activated. Activating a component route displays that component's view. Now let's add a menu and use the router link directive so the user can navigate to the views in our sample application. First, we need to decide how to show the routing options to the user. For our sample application, we'll build a menu. We want to add that menu at the root of our application, so we'll add it to the app component. In the app component template currently, we're nesting the product list component. Let's replace that with a navigation menu. This menu uses the nav element and the navbar classes from the Twitter Bootstrap styling framework. Let's see how this looks in the browser. Here is our new menu, but clicking on the menu options don't do anything yet, and our product list no longer appears. We need to tie routes to these menu options. Note that we currently have some runtime errors because we have not completed all of the steps needed for routing. Depending on your selected editor, you may not be able to run the application at this point with these errors. We'll be finishing up routing soon. We'll use the router link directive to tie a route to each of these menu options. For the home menu option, we'll add the router link to the anchor element, but we could use any clickable element. We want to tie the welcome route to the home menu option, so we specify welcome here. Pay close attention to this syntax. We assign the router link directive to an array defined within quotes. The first element of the array is a string, so it is also enclosed in quotes. We'll use similar syntax to tie the products route to the product list menu option. And since we are no longer nesting the product list component, we can remove its selector. Now we just need to tell Angular where to place our views and display the routed components template. When a route is activated, the associated components view is displayed. But displayed where? How do we specify where we want the routed component to display its view? We use the router outlet directive. We place that directive in the host components template. The routed components view then appears in this location. Let's add the router outlet to our sample application. We are back looking at the app component because it is the host for our router. We add the router outlet in the template where we want to display the routed components view. We'll put it here. Whenever a route is activated, the associated components view displays here. Let's see how that looks in the browser. Oh my, where did that page come from? That's the welcome page provided in the starter files. When the application launches, the default route is activated and the welcome view displays. If we click on the product list menu, the router link directive now activates the product list route and the product list view appears. Sweet! Our application component can now route to multiple views. Notice the URL. The URL segment we defined for the route is displayed here. If we type in something, like welcome, the welcome components view is displayed. Now that we have our routing in place, let's review how these routing features work together. When the user navigates to a feature tied to a route with a router link directive, the router link uses the link parameters array to compose the URL segment. The browser's location URL is changed to the application URL plus the composed URL segment. The router searches through the list of valid route definitions and picks the first match. The router locates or creates an instance of the component associated with that route. The component's view is injected in the location defined by the router outlet directive, and the page is displayed. We now have basic routing in our sample application. Yay! As we've seen in this course module, routing is rather intricate, requiring code in multiple files and strings such as parameter names and route paths that must match across those files. So let's finish up this module with some checklists that can help ensure all of the bits of routing are in the right places. To route or to nest? That is the question. When creating components, we need to think about how they will be displayed. For components designed to be nested within other components, we need to define a selector as part of the component decorator. The selector provides the name of the directive, and then we nest the component within another component using the directive to define where the component template appears. The component does not then need a route. For components designed to be displayed as a view within our single application page, the component needs no selector. But we do need to configure routes. We then tie those routes to actions, and action activates a route to display the view. If we want to do routing in our application, we need to configure the route definitions, tie routes to actions, and place the view. Let's do checklists for each of these tasks. The first step for doing routing in an application is to configure the routes. Begin by defining the base element in the index.html file. Add router module to an Angular modules imports array. Then add each route to the array passed to the router module's forRoute method. And remember that order matters. The router will pick the first route that matches. Each route definition requires a path, which defines the URL path segment for the route. Be sure the path has no leading slash. Use an empty path for a default route, and 2 asterisks for a wildcard route, which is matched if no prior path matches. Most route definitions also include a component. The component is a reference to the component itself. It is not a string name and is not enclosed in quotes. Once we have the routes configured, we need to tie those routes to actions. First, we identify which actions to tie to which routes. Then we add the router length directive as an attribute to any clickable element in a component's template. We can use them in menu options, toolbars, buttons, links, images, and so on. Be sure to enclose the router link in square brackets. Bind the router link to a link parameters array. The first element of the link parameters array is the route's path. All other elements in the array are values for the route parameters. Use the router outlet to identify where to display the routed component's view. This is most often specified in the host component template. When a route is activated, the route component's view is displayed at the location of the router outlet. This module was all about navigation and routing. We began with a look at how routing works. We then walked through how to configure routes, tie routes to actions, and define where the routed component's view should appear. Our app component had embedded our product list component as a nested component. In this module, we were finally able to remove that nesting. We set up routing so we can now navigate to our welcome and product list components. We've covered the basics of routing in this module, but there is so much more. In the next module, we'll look at some additional routing techniques and add navigation to the product detail component.